It's one of the greatest die-offs of any wildlife species that we're seeing, certainly in the past century. The white-nosed fungus is what's killing off a number of hibernating bats in the Northeast. In states like Maine and Vermont, it's estimated that the populations of little brown bats have collapsed more than 75%. It's questionable now how and if the bats are going to survive with this fungus. The project was designed in a way to determine if, and first off, would bats survive in an artificial setting, such as a bunker like this, and if they do survive in a bunker, how do we enable the bats to proliferate in the future? The bunkers actually mimic natural caves within the state of Maine. The bats responded in a very favorable way to being in the bunker here. They immediately went back into their torpor. They went to sleep, and they would arouse every few days to every few weeks, wake up, take a sip of water, and go back to sleep. We had 4 infrared motion-activated cameras monitoring the bats 24 hours a day, and I would come out here on the snowmobile twice a week, check on the bats, watch the computer monitor for half an hour to an hour at a time, making sure that the bats were behaving normally. And in March, the biologists from their respective states, New York and Vermont, came back up, picked up their bats, and took their respective bats back to the hibernacula in which they came from. This coming summer, we'll start compiling a database of swarming calls from bats. They make a certain echolocation swarming call before they go into hibernation in the fall. We'll start broadcasting that from ultra high frequency speakers and utilizing the solar panels up there. We'll bore holes into the top of the door here and allow the bats to passively come and go for hibernation, hoping that if they do choose to hibernate here, that their survival rates will be higher than in a cave because the fungus will not be present here.
One of the more striking observations of change was in some of the summers that I spent in Barrow, Alaska. So Barrow is basically on the tip of Alaska, northernmost in Alaska, and even in the summer, the sea ice was normally really close to Barrow, sometimes right up against land. And I was there in some of the summers that had the record minimum sea ice extent, so where the sea ice melted the most that it has in recorded history. And it was really interesting to be in the community of Barrow during that time because there were so many things that I noticed that people said were really unusual. So one is just standing on the beach, which is normally cold, foggy. It was hot and sunny, and there were mosquitoes, and people said that there are almost never mosquitoes that actually make it all the way up to the coast there. It's just too cold and windy for them. So that was something pretty unusual. Another was just the weather. Normally the sea ice is really close into the coast and it moderates the weather, so you feel that cold wind off the ice. There's a lot of fog. You notice, certain species like walrus along the sea ice edge. If you can go out to it on a boat, you can reach it by boat, things like that. So that's normal, but when the sea ice was so far away, the weather was a lot warmer. There were insects there, like I said, and people were either not noticing the species that normally hang out by the ice edge, or strange things were happening where those species would come to shore to haul out rather than on the ice. So there were major haul outs of walrus, which I didn't observe myself, but lots of people talked about on shore rather than on ice. So there are also polar bears that come to town sometimes, which is, I guess it happens, but there are more polar bears starting to use the land when the sea ice is so far away sometimes. I definitely noticed environmental variability, and I noticed things that were changing, but a big part of noticing that change was actually talking to people who were locals in each of the areas that I spent time in, had spent their whole life there, and had really observed big change, change over the span of 30 or 50 or 80 years. And being able to put my own observations in that context was really helpful.
From coastal lowlands to the highest altitude in the Caribbean, the Dominican Republic's beautiful and varied landscape seems to offer something for everyone, including the more than 300 species of birds that live here, many migrating long distances each winter. For the last 14 years, National Geographic grantee Chris Rimmer has also migrated south each winter from his home in Vermont. Chris began his work here in 1994 by pursuing a fellow Vermont resident, the Bicknell's thrush.
Originally, we came to begin to understand the winter ecology and conservation of the Bicknell's thrush, the long-distance migratory songbird that we study also on its breeding grounds in the northeast U.S. And this area, Sierra de Baruco, turns out to be very, very important for Bicknell's thrush. It contains a great deal of undisturbed, broadleaf, high-elevation montane forest, which is the primary habitat for Bicknell's thrush.
Each year, he returns to the exact same spot to set up his nets and traveling lab. His goal? To complete a comprehensive database of both migrant and resident bird species as a basis for sound management and conservation activities.
There are 31 endemic species which occur nowhere else in the world other than the island of Hispaniola. So those are some of the very important birds to the island, to the people that live here in Haiti and the Dominican Republic.
The result shows that shrinking habitats are a serious threat for birds in the Dominican Republic. In his surveys here, the number of male Bicknell's thrushes outnumbers females 4 to 1. The males dominate this prime habitat, forcing the females to live at lower elevations, areas with an inferior food supply, and areas more affected by human activity. This means that the females need special attention in order to ensure their survival over the winter.
So if you lose a patch of forest, the birds that are there, migratory and resident, they really have nowhere else to go. There's not enough habitat to support them. So it's crucial that we maintain some of these big areas of primary intact forest and that we begin to restore some of the other forest types that are important, say, in the case of the female Bicknell's thrushes. So it's a big challenge, and it's not happening overnight.
Well, this year's survey may be done, but next winter the Bicknell's thrush will return once again. And there's a pretty good chance that this biologist will too.
Well, currently, as of July 2010, the study is winding down. We expect the last GPS collars to drop off anytime now, within the next several weeks, and the plan is to wrap up the study. However, there's still some questions that need to be answered. What will the suitability of certain types of habitat that we're seeing on the landscape or expect to see? The logging practices have changed up there, and it's an intensively managed landscape. But we're not seeing these large clear cuts that in, say, 15 years post-cut would lead to good snowshoe hare habitat. But we don't know what those same habitats 15 years old and older will support. So that's an important information need that we have in order to make judgments and strategies for conserving lynx on the landscape in the future.
Sturgeon probably aren't influenced much by dams, so it might be water quality, overfishing, illegal fishing, and salmon, probably all of those features plus dams. And probably another influence on salmon is commercial fishing, I think we talked about with sturgeon. And one of my favorites is that now that there has been so much environmentalist fuss about killing seals, that the number of seals is increasing by as much as 1 million animals a year. And 1 million additional seals in the world must have an impact on a whole variety of fish. And another one would be introduced species that may be competing with salmon or sturgeon for space or food or eating eggs. Admit that salmon are declining and this is the fringe of their range, and just let's not worry about it. I get frustrated at the amount of money that we put into salmon restoration for essentially, in my view, a project that has not been successful for 150 years.